Carrie didn't return home immediately. After being walked out of Pinewood Plaza like a trespasser, she wandered through the quieter neighborhoods behind the shopping center, following sidewalks that curved under the soft arms of maple trees just starting to turn for autumn. The box she carried grew heavier with each step, though inside it were only a few remnants of a life built over 6 years, a framed photograph of her uncle in his paratrooper uniform, a ceramic coffee mug shaped like a sunflower, a tin of loose chamomile tea, and the keys she no longer had a reason to carry. She stopped at a park bench near an elementary school, the kind of bench where she'd once sat to make weekend calls to her aunt, or where she'd paused to eat a sandwich on her 15-minute lunch breaks. Now, the same bench felt foreign, like a place for someone else. Her shoulders were tense. Her mind buzzed. What she had done, what she had refused to do, kept looping in her head. She had been told, explicitly and with the full pressure of a management chain, to remove a man and his service dog from the building. But she'd looked at Roger Dean, at his trembling hands and the steady way Charlie sat pressed to his side, and realized that sometimes the rules required breaking. In that split second, Carrie had made a decision, kindness without condition. Even if it cost her everything. It did. Or so she thought. She finally made it home around dusk. Her apartment, modest and full of books, smelled faintly of lavender. The silence felt sharper than usual. Her phone had died hours earlier, and when she plugged it back in, the screen exploded with notifications. Missed calls. Voicemails. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize. At first, she assumed it was work-related, perhaps her coworkers offering sympathetic half-sentences. But it wasn't that. A video was circulating. Someone had recorded the confrontation. It showed Roger standing quietly in the plaza lobby, Charlie sitting obediently at his feet. Carrie was calm, her voice even, as she explained, 3 times, that Charlie was a trained service animal, and that federal law protected Roger's right to have him. The video ended with the arrival of the corporate representative and Carrie being dismissed without ceremony. Her resignation, if one could call it that, was captured in the way she adjusted her scarf and walked out, carrying only her small box and her pride. Within 12 hours, the video had reached 2 million views. The caption beneath it read, "She was fired for refusing to remove a veteran service dog." So the Marines showed up. The story struck a nerve. By morning, she had been on every major veteran forum online. Her email inbox, once a graveyard of corporate memos and holiday potluck signups, now held subject lines that read, "Thank you. You're a hero. My dad had PTSD, what you did means the world." Carrie hadn't even changed clothes yet when there was a knock at her apartment door. It was a boy from the neighborhood, 10 years old, skinny, with one sock falling down. He held a stack of envelopes tied with a red string. "My dad asked me to give you these," he said, his voice soft. "He's stationed in Germany." He saw the video. Carrie knelt down to accept the bundle, still unsure what to say. Inside the envelopes were letters, some typed on military base stationery, some handwritten in penmanship that bore the marks of decades in the service. One was from a master sergeant in Texas who had lost his leg to an IED and wrote, "People like you make the world livable for people like us." Another, from a young private, simply said, "You didn't raise your voice, but you spoke for all of us." Carrie sat on the floor, the letters spread around her like fallen leaves. She hadn't cried earlier, not when she was fired, not when she walked through the plaza parking lot, not when she unpacked the box, but now, alone in the quiet, the tears came freely. That afternoon, her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. "Ms. Lawson?" the voice asked. "Yes. This is Major Anthony Cortez, Fort Lyle." Carrie sat up straighter. "We'd like you to come to the base." "I'm not in trouble, am I?" she asked, a reflexive joke she instantly regretted. Major Cortez didn't laugh. "No, ma'am. Far from it. We'd just like to speak with you in person." The call ended with directions and a scheduled time. When she arrived at the base the next day, the guard at the gate greeted her with a salute. She was led to a modest building near the community center. Inside, framed photos lined the hallway, soldiers returning home, service dogs in training, gold stars next to the names of the fallen. In a conference room with simple chairs and an American flag tucked into one corner, Major Cortez met her. This time, he wasn't in dress uniform. He wore a windbreaker and carried a file. He slid it across the table. "We're creating a civilian position, head of veteran outreach. We need someone who understands not just policy, but people." Carrie blinked. "You don't even know me." Cortez leaned back. "We do now. We've seen the footage. But more importantly, we've spoken to Roger. He told us what you've done for him. The weekly check-ins, the plaza benches, even the hand warmers in winter. He said you never once asked for anything in return." She opened the file. It contained the job description and a starting salary she hadn't seen since leaving marketing. "We can't undo what happened," Cortez said. "But we can offer you a place where doing the right thing is the job." Carrie stared at the offer. She didn't speak for several seconds. When she looked up, there was no hesitation left in her. "I'll do it." When she left the base that evening, the sun had begun to dip, setting the fields around Fort Lyle ablaze with gold. Her box of belongings still sat in the trunk of her car, but now it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. 6 months passed, then 9. And slowly, the world Carrie once knew faded into the rearview. The fluorescent lights and weekly mall reports, the breakroom microwave and its always missing clock, replaced now by quiet conversations in modest rooms with people who had seen the worst the world could offer and still chose to show up, one day at a time. Carrie's days now began not with a clipboard but with a list of names, veterans awaiting follow-up calls, widows needing help with paperwork, a teenager who had stopped eating after his father's suicide. She remembered them all. She spoke softly, wrote thank you notes by hand, and carried granola bars in her desk drawer for the ones who arrived too proud to admit they hadn't eaten. The Bridges of Honor program took shape like clay in warm hands. It started with monthly meals for former service members, but Carrie added transportation shuttles, then legal aid partnerships, then a mentorship program that paired high schoolers with retired soldiers who could teach welding, computer repair, or sometimes just how to look someone in the eye and shake their hand. The base staff began calling her Commander Carrie, not mockingly, but with reverence. She laughed it off. She hadn't worn a uniform, hadn't been in combat. But she had fought a different kind of battle. One where dignity, not strategy, was on the line. Roger Dean became a fixture at Fort Lyle too. Every Friday at 3 p.m., like clockwork, he and Charlie would arrive in his old Buick, the dog's head poking out the passenger window. Roger wore his medals now, not every time, but often enough that the silence they once sat in no longer seemed to weigh him down. In a small sunlit room near the mess hall, he ran a support circle called The Long Way Home. Men who hadn't spoken about the war in decades began to trust their voices again. Young soldiers who came back from deployments too proud to say they were scared began to admit they needed help. And when words failed, Charlie always knew when to rest his head on a shaking knee. Back at Pinewood Plaza, changes began to take root. It started with the backlash, boycotts, critical editorials, social media fury. Management tried to bury it with apologies, but the community wanted something real. The plaza's parent company issued new accessibility guidelines. Not performative promises, but structural ones, permanent seating, redesigned entrances, dedicated rest zones with water and treats for service dogs. Carrie never returned to her old office, but she did return to the plaza. 3 months after her dismissal, a ceremony was held by the Central Fountain. Not organized by the company, but by the town council and Fort Lyle. Roger stood at the podium, his jacket pressed and his voice steady. Behind him were 3 Marines, the mayor, and a local journalist who had broken the story wide open. In the crowd stood Marlene from the bagel shop, Tim from the print store, the elderly couple who always played chess on Saturdays. And somewhere in the back, the regional inspector who had first tried to remove the dog, now silent, now small. A black cloth was pulled from the stone behind the fountain, revealing a bronze plaque etched in simple, unpretentious script. Sometimes, changing the system starts with refusing to remove the dog. In honor of Carrie Lawson, who stood for one and helped change it for all. The applause was quiet, respectful. But among those who had once turned away, there were tears. The boy who had delivered letters that morning long ago now volunteered at the base. His father, still stationed overseas, had called Carrie personally to thank her. Said his son had asked to become a military social worker one day. Said it started with her. The plaque became a gathering point. People left folded flags, dog tags, even letters. Carrie kept working, kept showing up. But now, when she walked through town, people didn't just nod, they stopped to ask how they could help. Veterans who had felt invisible now found seats reserved for them at community meetings. The local school invited soldiers to speak about honor and integrity. Churches held coat drives. A bakery donated breakfast to Bridges of Honor every Monday morning. The movement spread. Other towns called Fort Lyle to ask how they could replicate the program. Carrie flew to conferences, never comfortable with microphones, but always able to explain that it all began with listening. Not talking. Not correcting. Just listening. Years later, a photograph of Carrie was framed and hung in the new wellness wing of the base. She stood beside Roger and Charlie, one hand resting gently on the dog's head, the other holding a clipboard. Her smile was soft. She wasn't posing for history, just living it. And yet, her life had become the kind of story that others would tell. Not a grand hero's tale, but one about choosing kindness, again and again, even when no one's watching. Even when it costs you. Especially then. Because kindness isn't charity. It isn't weakness. It's strength in its most enduring form. The seasons shifted quietly around her. Spring brought daffodils outside the base chapel, and summer's first heat made the air shimmer above the blacktop where veterans gathered for morning flag ceremonies. Carrie no longer kept track of how long it had been since she'd left Pinewood Plaza. She measured time differently now, in letters answered, in meals served, in the careful, unhurried progress of someone learning to believe they still mattered. There was no moment of arrival. No parade. Just small things changing steadily, like rain carving a path through stone. Every Tuesday morning, she walked the perimeter of Fort Lyle with a notebook, checking on broken benches or stray cigarette butts left near the welcome signs. A new mural had been added to the outreach building, painted by a retired corporal with trembling hands and an eye for warmth. It depicted a service dog sitting in the shadow of a kneeling soldier. Above it were 5 words, "No one heals alone in silence." Carrie passed it every morning. She had stopped thinking of what she lost. The job at the plaza, the strained friendships with former coworkers who never stood beside her when it mattered. Those things had become like dust in the rearview, once clinging, now quietly gone. Instead, she thought of the veteran named Ellie who wrote poetry now, who laughed again. She thought of James, the widower who learned to make eggs for himself because she spent an hour showing him how. She thought of a 12-year-old girl who stood up in front of her class and shared that her mother was a soldier and she wasn't ashamed anymore. These weren't medals. These were moments. And they were enough. Back in town, Pinewood Plaza remained, new coat of paint, updated signage, even a veteran's corner near the coffee kiosk. On the first Sunday of every month, a folding table was set up beside the central fountain. Local volunteers handed out pamphlets, hot chocolate in winter, lemonade in summer. Sometimes Roger came, sometimes not. But Charlie was always there, his vest brushed clean, his demeanor calm. Carrie rarely visited, but when she did, she kept her distance. It wasn't her place anymore. And she didn't want it to be. The plaza had changed, but not for her. For the next person. For the ones who might need someone to say no when everyone else said nothing. One overcast afternoon, she received a letter, handwritten, formal, with a military seal. It wasn't a certificate or award. It was a request. The Pentagon had heard of the Bridges of Honor program. They wanted Carrie to consult on a national veteran reintegration model. The work she had done, quietly, locally, was now something others wanted to build on. She sat with the letter for hours before responding. In the end, she simply wrote, "If we start by listening, the rest will follow." She never chased recognition. She had known humiliation before she knew honor. But there was something extraordinary about being asked, not commanded, not assigned, but asked, to share what she had learned by staying kind when it would have been easier not to be. At a small award ceremony at Fort Lyle, Carrie stood in a simple navy dress, a war coin tucked into her palm. Major Cortez, older now, spoke of her legacy. "She reminded us," he said, "that defending dignity doesn't require rank. Only courage." In the crowd were new faces, young recruits, social workers, town council members. But also familiar ones. The inspector who had once insisted Charlie leave. She stood in the back, alone. Carrie nodded to her gently. The ceremony ended without pomp, but afterward, a man approached Carrie with his daughter. He said his wife had served in Afghanistan and had never talked about it until she visited Bridges of Honor. She didn't know anyone cared, he said. Now she volunteers here. Carrie smiled, knelt to pat the little girl's shoulder, and asked if she liked dogs. The girl nodded. "You'd like Charlie," she said. That night, she returned home and placed the war coin beside her uncle's photograph. It had been polished by dozens of hands before hers. It gleamed faintly in the evening light. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the quiet of the town settle like dust over rooftops. The world hadn't been radically transformed. There were still people being dismissed, veterans misunderstood, kindness rejected. But in one town, in a plaza, on a base, in the hearts of a few dozen people, something had shifted. A small, necessary resistance had bloomed. Not through outrage. Through quiet compassion. The kind that held the door open. That refilled the thermos. That stayed in the room when someone wept. Carrie had once feared insignificance. Now, she understood something deeper. That changing one moment for one person can echo longer than applause. Because dignity, once defended, doesn't fade. It multiplies. Kindness, after all, doesn't ask for permission. It simply shows up. And stays.